April 17th, 1837, St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. This is not one of those stories that begins with hope. It begins with a receipt, a name written as property, a body counted as inventory, and a patrol that rides as if the law itself is a whip in their hands. They called themselves the Bayou Lantern Patrol because they liked the sound of light. But what they carried into the dark wasn't light, it was permission. Permission to stop any black man on any road, to demand papers, to inspect the right to breathe, to turn suspicion into punishment, and punishment into entertainment. That was the system, and systems like this don't need proof. They need an example. His name was Elias Crowe, 29 years old, enslaved on the Duvalier Tract near the lower bends of the Atchafalaya Basin. Lean from hunger, not from choice. Hands rough from cane and cypress work, shoulders built by years of forced labor, useful shoulders, profitable shoulders. On paper, he was a line item. In flesh, he was a risk. Because the accusation wasn't petty theft, it wasn't insolence, it was the crime that plantation power fears the most. Organizing flight. Not running alone, not vanishing quietly, but gathering others, turning private despair into shared intention. That morning the patrol didn't find him by accident. People love to say these captures are chance encounters. He was spotted. He was recognized. He crossed the wrong road. That's the fairy tale version. The truth is uglier and more ordinary. Someone spoke. Someone was paid, threatened, pressured, or cornered. And once a name is offered, the machine knows exactly how to move. The patrol came with rope already cut to length. They came with a ledger page prepared to be filled in. They came with the certainty of men who believe the world is arranged for them by God and enforced by guns. Captain Silas Ketteridge led the ride. 42, parish-born, a man who preferred to be called captain, even when no uniform proved it. He had that particular kind of confidence that only exists when you've never been asked to justify your power in a room full of equals. He rode with 6 others, patrolmen pulled from neighboring tracks and small-town storefronts, men who played at authority to feel taller than they were. They didn't need training, they needed a target. They caught Elias near a narrow rise of ground where the road breaks into wetland. Late morning heat, the air already thick with insects. He didn't have a horse. He didn't have a pistol. He had what enslaved men usually had, speed in the legs, calculation in the eyes, and the knowledge that every second matters. The patrol closed in. One man swung down and struck him in the ribs with the butt of a musket, not to subdue him, but to mark the moment as theirs. Another shoved his face into the dirt, grinding his cheek against gravel, as if humiliation is part of the arrest procedure. Rope went around his wrists. Rope went around his neck, not tied tight enough to kill, but tight enough to remind him what they could do with one pull. They wanted him alive. Alive meant questions. Alive meant spectacle. Alive meant control. And here is where people make the mistake of imagining Elias as either a saint or a beast. The record, what little gets written, always tries to force enslaved men into 2 costumes, grateful victim or savage threat. Elias was neither. He was a man who understood the geometry of power. He understood that these men were not brave. They were authorized. Take away the authorization and the courage collapses like cheap wood in water. Ketteridge made a show of it on the road. He read the accusation out loud as if he were reading a verdict. Inciting theft of labor. Conspiracy to abscond. Assault on order. Grand phrases to disguise a simple reality. Elias was being punished for wanting to leave. For wanting others to leave. For treating his own life as something that belonged to him. They marched him to a backroom office above a feed store, one of those places where paperwork pretends to be justice. The room smelled of sweat and ink. A rough table, a straight-back chair, a nail on the wall where a man's hat could hang as if that mattered more than a man's dignity. Ketteridge had a ledger open and a bottle nearby because coercion likes to arrive with comfort for the coercer. Elias was made to stand, not allowed to sit, not allowed to lean. Standing is a posture of submission when someone else decides it. Ketteridge asked the first question like he already knew the answer. Where are the others? Elias didn't answer quickly. Quick answers satisfy interrogators. He let silence hang. He studied the room the way a hunted man studies a tree line, looking for weakness. Tells. Power always leaks information. A tells. Power always leaks information. A patrolman named Harlan Sykes, 30-ish, loud, eager, stepped forward and slapped Elias across the mouth. The sound wasn't just violence, it was a message to the other men. We are allowed. The slap split Elias's lip. Blood showed, and here's the detail they never account for. Blood can be a signal too. It can tell a man what time it is. Elias tasted iron and decided the hour for begging was over. Ketteridge tried again. Names, routes, meeting points. Elias looked at him, steady, and said what a smart captive says when surrounded by men addicted to control. He offered them more control than they could refuse. Not freedom, not mercy. He offered them a larger victory. He spoke carefully, not pleading, not boasting. Just enough humility to be believable. Just enough certainty to be tempting. You've caught the wrong prize, he said. The group you want isn't on this road. They're deeper. I can take you to them. You can hear the hook, can't you? The patrol didn't just want Elias. They wanted to bring back a pile of bodies and a bundle of names. They wanted the story to travel faster than the truth. Ketteridge cleansed the swamp. Ketteridge restored order. Ketteridge saved the parish. Authority loves a narrative because narrative is what keeps the public obedient. So Ketteridge leaned in. He asked how many. Elias gave a number that sounded plausible. Not too small to be worthless, not too large to be unbelievable. He offered a location described in the language of the swamp, a cut between cypress stands, a high patch of palmetto, a place where water runs slow and hides footprints. He spoke as if he knew, because he did know the terrain, because the enslaved always know the terrain. They work it. They suffer in it. They memorize it the way other men memorize prayer. Ketteridge's eyes sharpened. His pride did the rest. He made a decision that was not tactical but psychological. He wanted to be the man who takes credit. He wanted the parish to hear that Elias Crowe didn't just get caught. He was turned. That the organizer became an instrument of capture. It would be the perfect humiliation, the perfect lesson to the others. Even your leaders will fold. So he ordered the rope on Elias's wrists loosened. Not removed, loosened. Enough to walk without stumbling. Enough to point, to gesture, to guide. They kept the neck rope, they kept the guns, they kept their smugness. And smugness, in the wrong landscape, is a liability. They set the movement for the next day. April 18th, 1837. They would ride out with Elias at the front, like a bloodhound on a leash. Ketteridge even wrote it into the ledger, a cooperative subject, as if cooperation can exist under a noose, as if any word spoken under coercion is clean. Listen closely to what this moment really is. It's the system congratulating itself. Men with weapons, men with papers, men with badges they made for themselves, believing the world is so thoroughly theirs that even the trapped must serve them. They are already celebrating. They can already hear the praise. They can already see themselves walking into town with a captured group behind them, proof of their control. But here's the truth the ledger won't write. Elias Crowe was not bargaining for their approval. He was measuring their greed. He was testing their discipline. He was counting their mistakes before they made them. And when a patrol loosens the rope because it wants a bigger victory, it is confessing something it will never admit out loud. It is vulnerable to pride. That is what April 17, 1837 really records. Not just an arrest, but an opening, an ending that looked inevitable, cracked open by the oldest weakness in the machinery of oppression, arrogance. And if you're listening from anywhere, any city, any parish, any country, where power has ever worn a uniform and called itself order, comment where you're from, not for vanity. For accountability, because names and dates are how we refuse the erasure. Subscribe if you want this kind of story told the way it deserves to be told, without excuses, without softening, and without letting the guilty hide behind how things were back then. April 18, 1837. The patrol called it a transport. A simple move from one point of custody to another, as if a man's life can be reduced to logistics. But transport is never neutral when the cargo is human. It is a ritual of dominance. Boots on boards, rope tightened just enough, firearms displayed like scripture. That morning, Captain Silas Ketteridge did not wake up thinking about truth. He woke up thinking about authority. And authority, in St. Martin Parish, was not a principle. It was an arrangement enforced by men who could kill and then call it procedure. This is what the Bayou Lantern Patrol really carried. Not just muskets, but permission. Permission signed in invisible ink by plantation owners who needed the parish roads to stay predictable. Permission blessed by local magistrates who preferred order over justice. Permission reinforced by neighbors who looked away because looking directly would mean admitting what they were benefiting from. The patrol's violence was not random. It was subsidized. It was community-funded terror with a polite name. Kettridge understood this. He used it like a tool. He also used something else, reputation. He wasn't merely chasing runaways. He was defending a brand. The Lantern Patrol had to appear omnipresent, infallible, and feared. If enslaved people began to believe the patrol could be evaded, or worse, embarrassed, the parish would learn a dangerous new idea, that the system is not a law of nature. It's a practice, and practices can be disrupted. So Kettridge staged his morning the way a prosecutor stages a case. He arranged the narrative before he gathered the facts. He assembled 7 men and distributed roles, 2 on point, 2 flanking, 1 riding behind Elias with the neck rope looped in his fist like a leash. The rest spread out as watchers, rifles angled so any passerby could read the message instantly. This man is ours, and this road is ours, and your body is ours if we decide it is. They didn't need a courtroom. They made the road the courtroom. They made the swamp the jail. They made their own hands the judge's signature. Elias Crowe walked ahead of them with his wrists tied but loosened, as promised. Loose rope is still rope. It's simply rope that allows movement, and movement is what Kettridge believed he controlled. He thought he'd invented the perfect arrangement. Elias would guide them to a larger prize, and then Elias would be punished as the man who betrayed others. That was the plan, and it was monstrous in a particularly bureaucratic way. The system loves forcing victims into complicity because it spreads guilt around like mud and then tells everyone the stain is natural. But there was a fact Kettridge refused to face. Elias was already reading them, not as individuals with souls, but as a unit with weaknesses. Elias had watched them in that backroom office the day before. He had measured their discipline and found it theatrical. He had heard the thin edge in their threats, the way men threaten louder when they are not fully certain. He had seen who craved approval. He had seen who drank early. He had seen who wanted to impress the captain. And now, on April 18th, he watched them again, in motion, where habits become clearer. The patrol's real weapon was not the musket. It was the assumption that everyone else believed in their inevitability. They rode as if the parish itself had granted them gravity. They acted like their power was a permanent feature of the landscape, like cypress trees, like mud, like the sun rising. This is how oppression survives, by convincing people it is natural. By calling its violence order. By teaching the enslaved to anticipate punishment so thoroughly that anticipation becomes a cage. Kettridge kept talking as they moved, not because conversation was necessary, but because domination likes to hear itself speak. He asked Elias questions that were not questions. How many? Where do they sleep? Who's the leader? He wanted Elias to confirm the story he had already written in his head. That escape was a conspiracy, that conspiracies need masterminds, and that he, Kettridge, was the man qualified to crush them. Every answer Elias gave was carefully shaped to satisfy the patrol's hunger while steering them toward a place where their hunger would become a liability. They passed through low ground where the road narrowed and the swamp pressed close. Elias pointed toward a stand of cypress and claimed a path beyond it led to high, dry cover. The patrol accepted this without verification because verification is not what entitlement does. Entitlement assumes the world will comply. And when the world does not comply, entitlement calls it betrayal, as if the world owes obedience. There is an uglier detail here that matters. The patrol did not ride alone in a moral vacuum. Along the route, they were seen. Farmers on porches, men by supply carts, a boy carrying water. People who witnessed an enslaved man tethered like an animal and a group of armed whites escorting him as if the spectacle were a public service. Some looked away. Some smirked. Some nodded as if to approve. This complicity is part of the crime. A system does not need everyone to participate. It only needs most people to accept the performance. By midday, the heat tightened around them. Mosquitoes found skin. The air smelled like rot and wet vegetation. The horses grew nervous at the edges of water. One of the patrolmen, Harlan Sykes, complained about the pace. Another, Caleb Morrow, older, quieter, kept checking the tree line, less confident than the others, because he knew the swamp can swallow a man without leaving a body to bury. Kettridge saw the discomfort and corrected it the way he corrected everything, with aggression. He mocked Morrow's caution. He told Sykes to stop whining. He bragged about past captures, inflating details the way insecure men inflate stories. He wanted unity, but what he built was something else. Overconfidence layered over fatigue. Lowers his rifle because his shoulders, lowers his rifle because his shoulders ache. Someone drinks from a flask and loses sharpness in the eyes. These are not cinematic mistakes. They are ordinary. The patrol's violence came with patterns. The patrol's violence came with patterns. They used fear as a shortcut. They used intimidation instead of precision. They believed their presence alone would prevent resistance. They did not imagine a captive could be a tactician. That blindness is not accidental. It is required. To treat people as property, you must deny their competence. You must refuse to see their mind as a weapon. By late afternoon, they reached a point where the ground began to change. The road thinned into a raised strip of earth, water on both sides. The swamp made the horizon feel closer, like the world narrowing into a corridor. Elias slowed slightly, not enough to look suspicious, just enough to draw them deeper. Ketteridge ordered him forward, impatient. He wanted the prize before nightfall. He wanted to return with news, because the patrol's power depends on being seen as constantly successful. A delay would invite questions. Questions are dangerous. Questions lead to doubt, and doubt is the first crack in the parish's obedience. Elias suggested they camp near a dry patch he claimed was safe, because the others would be close by at dawn. Ketteridge refused. He didn't want to pause. He wanted to press. He wanted to break the story open quickly so he could own it, and in that refusal he exposed the second lie beneath the patrol's authority. Their decisions were not driven by strategy. They were driven by vanity. This is what the patrol did to the parish. They replaced justice with theater. They replaced evidence with intimidation. They replaced law with impulse and then called it duty. On April 18, 1837, the Bayou Lantern Patrol was not hunting criminals. They were hunting control, hunting the right to keep the parish afraid. And Elias Crowe, walking ahead with rope on his skin, understood something they did not. Control is not a weapon you carry. It is a belief you maintain. If you can make the enforcers look fallible, if you can make them look foolish, the belief begins to die. And that is why this day matters, not because any gun fired, not because any blood was spilled, but because the patrol's true weapon, permission, was about to be tested against a terrain that does not respect badges, against fatigue that does not fear threats, and against a man who refused to accept the story written for him. We are obligated to remember that, because forgetting is how these systems repeat. Names, dates, places, these are not decorations. They are the nails that pin a crime to history so it cannot crawl away. April 19th, 1837. This is the day the trap stops being an idea and becomes a schedule. The Bayou Lantern Patrol wakes with the kind of confidence that only comes from never having to question its own right to exist. Captain Silas Ketteridge doesn't treat the swamp as a threat. He treats it as a stage. He believes the land will hold still while he performs authority on it. That belief is the first error, and it is not a harmless one. It is the same arrogance that makes men confuse power with competence, a badge with a brain, a musket with a moral license. Elias Crowe wakes with rope marks on his skin and a calculation in his mind. He is 29 years old, enslaved, and being marched like a tool toward a crime the patrol wants to film into the parish memory. But Elias is not thinking about their story. He is constructing his own. Not in the language of speeches, not in the language of fantasies. This is not that kind of tale. He is constructing it in distances, in timing, in the predictable failures of men who have never been forced to improvise under threat. Ketteridge demands proof, but not the kind that holds up in any honest court. He wants the proof that makes him look decisive. So he orders Elias forward again, deeper into the Atchafalaya back swamps. The patrol tightens the formation at first, then loosens it as the day wears on. The swamp does that. It breaks discipline without firing a shot. Vines snag boots. Water erases tracks. Insects punish skin. Horses spook when the ground turns soft. The men begin to sweat through their bravado. Their mouths dry out. Their tempers shorten. The patrol's cohesion becomes something they have to maintain rather than something they assume. And that maintenance costs energy they do not realize they are spending like a leaking purse. Elias offers them what they think is a shortcut. He points toward a thinner corridor through the trees and tells them the real group uses it at dusk. He claims the path avoids deeper water and leads to a dry rise where a camp can be set without smoke showing. Notice the precision. The lie has to sound like knowledge. It has to feel like a local secret. It has to flatter the patrol's fantasy that they are being invited into hidden territory as victors, not being guided into it as prey. Ketteridge accepts because he wants to accept. That is how entrapment works when the trapped are proud. The captain convinces himself he is steering the day, but he is following the direction of his own appetite. He imagines the parish hearing his report. We turned the organizer. We walked him to the nest. He wants the story so badly he stops investigating the facts. That is not merely foolishness, it is culpability. When men abandon verification because they prefer a narrative, they are not unlucky if they suffer consequences. They are responsible. Elias's rope is still there, still a constraint, but it is also a prop the patrol uses to reassure itself. The neck rope, especially, is their comfort object. It tells them he cannot run. It tells them he cannot betray. The rope becomes their substitute for vigilance. They do not see that the rope is only effective if the men holding it remain disciplined. Discipline is what the swamp is quietly dissolving. By midday, the patrol reaches a patch where the ground narrows and the trees form a darker lattice overhead. Elias slows just enough to prompt irritation, then he gives Ketteridge something else, a confession shaped like an opportunity. He says calmly that the group is larger than they think. He drops a number. He adds a detail about supplies, stolen blankets, hidden food, maybe a pistol taken from a careless overseer weeks ago. He is feeding them the fuel that patrols run on, the fear that the enslaved might be armed, might be organized, might be becoming something other than obedient. And then he offers the antidote. Follow me and you can crush it before it spreads. Ketteridge's eyes harden. Sykes grins, eager for confrontation. The men murmur. This is the patrol's psychology in its purest form. They believe the enslaved must be kept helpless not only physically, but symbolically. A whisper of black agency makes them feel the ground shift. Watches this and adjusts. Because the watches this and adjusts. Because the objective is not to win a battle today. The objective is to get them into bad terrain while their bodies are already failing. The objective is to turn their weapons from tools into burdens. The objective is humiliation so complete it damages the patrol's authority beyond this ride, so the parish whispers about it, so plantation owners question it, so recruits hesitate, so the patrol's permission begins to look fragile. Late afternoon, the swamp becomes less forgiving. Water appears in unexpected places, black, still, deceptive. The path Elias indicates is not an obvious trail. It is a way through, the kind only someone who has lived under this canopy would recognize. A slight break in palmetto, a line of drier leaves, a subtle rise where roots knot together. The patrol follows because they have already invested in believing him. Their pride has a cost now. To turn back would be to admit doubt. And doubt is an insult to the role Ketteridge has cast himself in. Here is the deal in the dirt, the transaction that becomes the hinge of everything. Elias tells Ketteridge they will reach the camp faster if the patrol stops treating him like a prisoner and starts using him like a guide. He asks, carefully, for one more concession. Loosen the wrist rope again, so he can push branches aside without stumbling, so he can point without straining, so he can move quietly. He frames it as benefit for them. That's the trick. Make the oppressor think the concession is a tactical upgrade, not a moral surrender. Ketteridge weighs it, then nods. Not because he trusts Elias, but because he trusts his own ability to dominate. He believes his men, his guns, his rope, and his name are enough to compensate for any risks. He makes the adjustment like a man signing off on a minor supply request. This is the moment the patrol mistakes control for certainty. A more careful leader would have refused. A more careful leader would have questioned why a captive suddenly needs freedom of movement in a landscape designed to conceal movement. But Ketteridge is not careful. He is invested in speed and spectacle. The wrist rope loosens. Elias rolls his shoulders slightly as if relieved, as if grateful. He lowers his gaze, as if humbled. It is performance, and it is necessary. The patrol has to believe they are shaping him. They cannot suspect he is shaping them. Oppressors are allergic to the idea that their victims might be acting rather than reacting. Elias uses that allergy. As evening approaches, the patrol's senses dull, not because they are stupid, but because their bodies are tired and the swamp is relentless. They do speak, it is harsher. The tone of they do speak, it is harsher. The tone of the group changes from confident to irritable. Irritability is a precursor to mistakes. Elias leads them toward a corridor where the ground will worsen after dark. He does not announce this. He does not warn them. He simply keeps moving as if the path is natural. He uses their impatience as a whip. He knows they will push forward because stopping would mean admitting the swamp is stronger than their authority, and men like Ketteridge cannot tolerate that admission, not publicly, not privately. This is the prosecutable reality beneath the drama. On April 19, 1837, the patrol is not simply escorting a captive. They are making a series of reckless, pride-driven operational decisions in hostile terrain based on coerced information, while armed, while deputized, while accountable to no one who will punish them for failure except their own reputations. That is a recipe for disaster. And when disaster comes, it will not be an accident. It will be the bill coming due. Remember this day. Remember it because it exposes how power actually collapses, not with a single heroic act, but with a chain of small concessions granted by arrogance. A loosened rope, a rushed decision, a shortcut taken for glory. The swamp does not care about their titles. The record should not either. Our obligation is to name the mechanism, to mark the date, to refuse the convenient lie that brutality is competent just because it is brutal. April 20th, 1837. The patrol rides into the hour where weapons stop being power and start being weight. In the parish stories, they would later call it bad ground, as if the land betrayed them. But land doesn't betray. Land simply refuses to cooperate. The betrayal came from inside the patrol, inside the laziness of their planning, inside the vanity that replaced caution, inside the assumption that a black man in rope cannot be the one designing the geometry of the day. By morning, the swamp air has turned thick enough to feel like a hand over the mouth. Mosquitoes press into every exposed seam of skin. Boots squelch and never fully dry. The trees crowd close, cypress and tupelo, their roots rising like knuckles from the water. And in this environment, the patrol's most beloved symbol, those long muskets, becomes a liability. A musket wants clean space. It wants predictable lines. It wants clear sight. The swamp offers none of that. Every branch is a snag. Every vine is a choke. Every step is a question mark. The patrol's authority begins to look ridiculous, like men wearing medals while sinking. Elias Crowe keeps moving. His pace is steady, not hurried. He understands that rushing makes them suspicious. He also understands something more damning. The patrol does not know this terrain the way he does. They call it wilderness, as if that absolves them for being ignorant. But it's not wilderness to the enslaved. It is workplace. It is hiding place. It is a map learned through necessity. Elias reads the ground like text. He sees where the mud will swallow a boot. He sees where a horse will hesitate. He sees where sound travels and where it dies. And he chooses the route accordingly, not to find a camp but to dismantle the patrol's formation. Captain Silas Ketteridge keeps the neck rope in his hand. He thinks that means control. But watch what control becomes out here. A distraction. One hand is occupied. One eye is on Elias. The captain's attention narrows, and narrowing attention in a swamp is how people get hurt. Ketteridge has been trained by comfort to focus on domination, not on survival. That is the contradiction at the core of his authority. He can terrorize men on open roads. He can bully in towns. But the swamp does not fear him. The swamp does not respect his title. And so, slowly, his confidence becomes a kind of denial. They push into a corridor where the water rises and the ground breaks into patches. Dry, wet, like a cruel rhythm. The patrol tries to keep formation, but formation requires agreement. Agreement requires discipline, and discipline requires energy they no longer have. One patrolman steps wide to avoid a sinkhole. Another drifts back to swat insects and cough. A third lags because his boot is filled with water, and every step now feels like lifting a brick. They spread out without noticing. They separate without admitting it. Elias notices every inch. Harlan Sykes is the first to grow reckless. He wants this to end. He wants the runaway camp to appear like a reward so he can stop pretending this ride is noble and admit what it really is, misery. He barks at Elias to move faster. He jabs the air with his musket like the gun itself is supposed to intimidate the swamp. Elias does not react. That calm is an accusation. It suggests Elias has patience and the patrol does not. And patience is dangerous out here because patience belongs to the one who can wait without dying. The path Elias chooses begins to force decisions. A narrow strip of raised earth appears, bordered by water and tangled growth. If they stay on it, they must move single file. If they try to flank, they must step into water that hides holes and roots that can break ankles. Either choice disrupts them. That is the point. Elias is not searching for a place. He is arranging them into a shape that makes their weapons clumsy. In a line, a musket becomes a pole that cannot swing. In thick growth, A rifle cannot be shouldered without snagging. And when you cannot shoulder your weapon, what exactly are you? A man with a stick and a story. Ketteridge orders them to keep tight. They try, but trying does not erase the fact that the swamp is now dictating the spacing. The captain's voice becomes sharper, not because he is gaining control, but because he feels it slipping. You can hear the change in men like him. They begin to command more loudly when the world stops obeying automatically. The patrolmen exchange looks, brief, irritated, uncertain. Uncertainty is contagious. It spreads faster than courage. Elias introduces the next layer, sound, not the dramatic sound of gunfire, the smaller sounds that manipulate the nervous system. A splash behind them, a rustle to the left, a bird call that doesn't match the hour. He uses distance and timing so it can't be pinned to a single source. The patrol turns their heads too often. They scan the wrong places. Their eyes tire. Their fear rises. Not the fear of death, but the fear of being made fools in front of each other. That fear is what keeps them moving forward. That fear is what keeps them from turning back. Elias is prosecuting them with their own pride. The deeper they go, the more the guns stop feeling like safety. You can hold a musket, but you cannot aim cleanly through vines. You can have a pistol, but your hands are wet and your powder is vulnerable. You can carry authority, but your boots are sinking and your lungs are burning. The swamp turns their equipment into liabilities one by one. Straps chafe. Powder horns thump against ribs. Metal catches light and gives away position. The patrol is supposed to be the hunter. The patrol begins to move like prey. Tense, reactive, jumpy. Elias guides them into a section where cypress knees rise everywhere. Those knobby roots create a field of trip points. The horses struggle here, stepping uncertainly. One patrolman curses and yanks his horse too hard, and the animal jerks sideways. Another man has to grab the reins to steady it, breaking his attention from the surroundings. A third man lifts his musket higher to avoid snagging it on a root and nearly loses his balance. These aren't heroic failures. They're mundane, and mundane is what humiliates men who built their identities on competence they never had to prove. By afternoon, fatigue is no longer a feeling, it is a structural problem. The patrol spacing increases because tired men drift. Their discipline cracks because thirst makes them short-tempered. Their vigilance collapses because the brain cannot stay sharp when the body is struggling. Elias begins to see the moment approaching when he can separate them without force. He does not need to fight them. He needs to make them fragment. Fragmentation is the beginning of disarmament. This is where the patrol system shows its real face. It was never designed for difficult work. It was designed for easy victims. It was designed to dominate the vulnerable on open roads, to chase those already starved, already exhausted, already hunted. It was not designed to operate in a landscape that negates visibility, that punishes haste, that rewards local knowledge. The patrol's authority depends on conditions. Elias is stripping those conditions away. Late day, the light changes. The canopy makes dusk arrive early. Shadows thicken. The swamp starts to look like one continuous surface. Water, bark, mud, leaf, everything blending into a dark texture. Ketteridge tightens his grip on the neck rope again, instinctively, as if squeezing harder can undo geography. He tells Elias they're close. He tells his men they're close. Quietly, beyond there. A simple phrase, quietly, beyond there. A simple phrase. It feeds their hunger. It gives them a finish line. They push into the growth, single file, muskets angled awkwardly, boots slipping, shoulders scraped by branches. Their weapons are now dead weight they cannot deploy quickly. Their voices are low, not out of tactical discipline, but because the environment has intimidated them into quiet. They are no longer performing dominance. They are surviving. And here is the moral fact that must be recorded. The patrol did not lose control because the swamp was unfair. They lost control because they believed they could treat a man as property and still expect reality to cooperate. They believed permission could substitute for competence. They believed rope could substitute for vigilance. They believed guns could substitute for strategy. April 20th, 1837, exposes that lie with brutal clarity. When oppression meets terrain, it cannot bully. It begins to reveal how fragile it always was. Remember that. Not because the swamp is romantic, not because nature is noble, but because the truth is prosecutorial. The patrol's power was never divine. It was conditional. Elias Crowe is not yet free on April 20th. But the patrol is already failing. Their weapons are still in their hands, but their authority is already slipping out of their grasp. And once authority slips, men like Ketteridge do not respond with reflection. They respond with panic, and panic, in the wrong landscape, is a confession. April 20th, 1837. Dusk. This is where the patrol's mythology dies, not with a heroic firefight, not with a dramatic last stand, but with something far more humiliating. A quiet extraction. The Bayou Lantern Patrol came armed, deputized, and certain. They believed weapons were the same thing as control. In a swamp, that belief turns into a joke you don't laugh at until after the damage is done. The patrol had been pushed all day by fatigue and terrain, pulled forward by pride and narrowed into a moving column that could not pivot quickly, could not see far, could not communicate cleanly. Captain Silas Ketteridge kept the neck rope like a talisman, but talismans do not stop a man who understands leverage. Elias Crowe was still tethered, still watched, still in custody. And yet the patrol was already working for him without knowing it, because the patrol's real weakness was not physical. It was procedural. They moved like men who had never needed to secure a perimeter in hostile ground. They moved like men used to victims collapsing before contact. They moved like men who confuse intimidation with skill, and intimidation has no traction in mud. Elias did not need them dead. He needed them disorganized. He needed them separated by a few yards at the right time, in the right darkness, with the right amount of panic. That is how authority collapses. Not in one blow, but in a series of small, accelerating failures. He began with sound, small controlled provocations in the swamp's language, a splash too far to confirm, a rustle close enough to feel, a brief bird call that doesn't belong in that hour, the kind that makes tired men doubt their senses. The patrol reacted exactly as expected. Harlan Sykes drifted off the line first, always eager to chase a phantom because he needed to prove he wasn't afraid. Caleb Morrow stayed closer but kept turning his head, scanning the trees like a man who knows he's in the wrong place. Another patrolman, Jude Ralston, younger, rattled, kept adjusting his musket strap because the barrel kept catching vines. Every adjustment is a distraction. Every distraction is a window. Elias watched those windows open and close until the timing was right. Then he introduced the bait that patrols cannot resist. A glimpse of the group. He angled his body slightly, as if noticing movement ahead. He paused for half a breath, just long enough to trigger suspicion, not long enough to seem staged. Ketteridge leaned forward and hissed for him to keep moving. Elias whispered, "There," and pointed toward thicker growth, toward a narrow passage where the cypress knees rose like obstacles in a corridor. This was not a route to a camp. It was a route to fragmentation. The patrol surged forward in single file, trying to close distance on something they could not verify. That surge did what Elias needed it to do. It stretched the line. The men in back could not see the men in front. The men in front could not hear the men in back. Their unity became a memory rather than a fact. And now the decisive detail. Muskets are not agile weapons in close growth. A long gun needs space. In that passage, space did not exist. Ralston's barrel snagged first, catching on a low branch. He jerked it free with annoyance, and the motion pulled his strap loose. The musket slid down his shoulder, and he grabbed at it reflexively. Stepped off the raised strip to flank. Stepped off the raised strip to flank. Thinking he was clever, and his boot sank deeper than expected. He cursed, yanked hard, lost balance, and planted the butt of his musket into the mud to steady himself. He had just turned his weapon into a crutch. That is what the swamp does. It forces armed men into postures of vulnerability. Ketteridge snapped orders, but his voice was swallowed by foliage. The men kept moving because stopping felt worse than moving. That is the patrol's addiction, motion as proof of control. Elias allowed himself to stumble slightly, just enough to make Ketteridge tighten the neck rope and step closer. Now the captain is within arm's reach, attention fixed on the captive, not on his perimeter. The rope, meant to restrain Elias, has pulled the most important armed man into the exact distance Elias prefers. That is not luck. That is design. The extraction does not happen with a brawl. It happens with misdirection and inevitability. Elias lets the line compress at a choke point where branches force shoulders to turn sideways. He points again, right there, and the patrol's eyes go where he wants them. Their heads tilt forward, pupils straining into dusk, hunting for shapes. Their fear is now doing the work. In that moment, Ralston's loosened strap slips again. The musket slides, clatters softly against a root, and for a second he is not a patrolman. He is a man scrambling to keep his hands on his own property. He bends. He reaches. He loses his horizon. That is the opening. Something moves in the brush. Fast, low, practiced. Not a monster, not a myth. A human body that knows how to move in this terrain. The musket is gone before Ralston can even register that it is being taken. No shot, no struggle, just absence. The swamp is full of absences. This one is personal. Sykes, still fighting the mud, shifts his weight and frees his boot, but the movement pulls his musket butt deeper into the muck. He yanks it up, and wet suction fights him. His grip slips, the barrel swings, hits a vine, twists his hands awkwardly. He curses again, loud, panicked, angry at the land as if the land is obligated to help him. In his frustration, he lowers the weapon to re-grip it, and that is the second opening. Another quick movement through brush, closer than he expected, and the musket is no longer in his hands. He spins, trying to locate the thief, but dusk has erased the neat division between tree and shadow. His weapon has turned from security into an accusation. You were armed, and still you were outplayed. Ketteridge hears the commotion and turns. He sees confusion, hears curses, senses the line unraveling. He tightens the neck rope hard. Elias's body is pulled back a fraction, and in that fraction Elias uses the rope's tension as leverage. He shifts his weight, forcing Ketteridge to step forward to maintain control. That step matters. It brings the captain off the most stable ground. It brings him closer to the roots and water where footing is unreliable. Ketteridge tries to raise his pistol, but his other hand is managing the rope, and managing the rope has become the burden. This is what happens when you build authority around restraint. The restraint consumes the authority's attention. Elias does not need to win a duel. He needs the captain to fumble. And Ketteridge does fumble. Just a small one. A wet boot sliding on a root, a shoulder bumping a branch, a moment of frustration that turns his weapon hand into a clenched fist instead of a controlled aim. That moment is enough. The pistol is taken with the same quiet brutality as the muskets. Not brutality of blood, but brutality of competence. A hand appears, the pistol is gone, and Ketteridge is left holding rope like an idiot, staring at the space where his permission used to live. Now the patrol's power evaporates rapidly, because their weapons were not merely tools, they were symbols. A patrolman without a musket is not a patrolman. He is a trespasser in a swamp. He is a man with wet boots and no authority. The remaining patrolmen freeze, eyes wide, scanning. They are no longer hunters. They are targets who don't know where the shooter would be if there were one. And that is the twist. Elias does not need to fire a shot to weaponize their fear. The idea that someone else now holds the guns is enough. The patrol's confidence collapses into the most humiliating form of terror, the terror of being watched. Elias uses the confusion as cover to sever the final thread of custody. In the turmoil, the neck rope slackens for the first time all day, not because Ketteridge is merciful, but because Ketteridge is overwhelmed. Elias steps into the darkness where the ground drops and foliage thickens, exactly where he has been steering them. The rope slips free or is cut in the confusion. Either way, the result is the same. The captive is no longer in the shape the patrol needs him to be. He is no longer transport. He is no longer asset. He is a moving problem in a landscape that refuses to cooperate with white authority. When the patrol regroups, it does so in fragments. One man yelling for another, someone calling the captain's name too loudly, someone swearing at phantoms. And the most devastating fact is not that they lost weapons. It is that they cannot even say exactly how. Because there was no honorable fight to romanticize. There was no enemy to blame in a clean sentence. There was only the truth. They were disarmed by terrain, fatigue, and a captive they underestimated. Their pride forced them into a corridor, and their corridor became a funnel through which their authority drained away. This is why April 20th, 1837 matters. Not because it gives us an easy hero story to consume and forget, but because it exposes a mechanism. Oppression depends on performance. It depends on the belief that the enforcers are always in control, always feared, always competent. Elias Crowe shattered that belief without spectacle, and that kind of humiliation is contagious. Once people hear the patrol can be stripped of its weapons, quietly, efficiently, in its own territory, the parish begins to whisper a different possibility. We are obligated to record that whisper, because forgetting is how the performance resets. Names, dates, methods. The difference between a myth and an indictment is memory that refuses to be softened. April 21st, 1837. The patrol wakes into an aftermath they cannot discipline. They have no clean report, no neat chain of custody, no body to display, no captured ring of fugitives to justify the ride. They have something worse, missing guns and missing certainty. A patrol that loses its weapons does not just lose mettle, it loses its narrative. And the parish lives on narrative. It lives on the belief that the Bayou Lantern Patrol can appear anywhere, seize anyone, and return with proof. On April 21st, that belief is bleeding out into swamp water, and Captain Silas Ketteridge knows it. He will spend the rest of the day trying to stitch a story over a wound that will not close. Elias Crowe does not celebrate. Celebration is loud. Loud gets you killed. He moves the way enslaved men move when they are serious about living, low, measured, disappearing into the logic of the land. He has a weapon now, not as a trophy, but as leverage. A musket taken from men who wore it like a crown. A pistol taken from a captain who believed a rope could substitute for vigilance. The firearms are not magic. They are heavy, vulnerable to moisture, and useless without discipline. But discipline is exactly what Elias has, and the patrol does not. He wraps metal in cloth. He keeps powder dry the best he can. He counts every step, every pause, every sound. He is building an escape corridor that does not depend on speed alone. It depends on psychology. The patrol's fear of being shot is more valuable than any bullet. He does not run straight. He loops. He doubles back through reeds and cypress knees where footprints become guesses. He chooses ground that punishes pursuers. He knows where water forces a man to lift his knees high, tiring him faster. He knows where the mud sucks boots and slows a chase to a crawl. He knows where sound travels, where a shout becomes a beacon. And he uses this knowledge not just to flee, but to return, because escape is not only a direction, it is a network. By dawn, he reaches the first prearranged point, a dry rise of palmetto and fallen timber near a slow-moving cut, a place that looks ordinary to outsiders and deliberate to those who know. He signals quietly, 2 clicks of the tongue, then silence. A shadow answers with a low bird call, wrong for the morning on purpose. Mara Voss emerges first, 26, her face set hard by years of rationed life. She does not gasp at the sight of the weapons. She does not ask how. She simply looks at Elias's eyes and understands this is not luck. It is a change in the balance. Behind her comes Jonah Pike, 32, wide-shouldered and careful, carrying a bundle of food wrapped tight. And then little Renee, 17, thin, watchful, a boy whose childhood has been replaced by logistics. These names matter because the system prefers numbers. It prefers runaways as a category. Naming is refusal. Naming is record. Naming is how we deny the plantation its favorite trick, to make people vanish into labels. Elias speaks in short phrases, not inspirational, operational. They're behind. They're angry. They're missing guns. They'll search wide. He shows the pistol briefly, then wraps it again. The group doesn't cheer. They get to work. That is what survival looks like when you've lived under a regime that kills noise. Mara checks the route. Jonah checks the waterline. Renee checks the rear, listening for horse snorts, for men stepping careless on routes. They move like people who have been forced to develop competence as a substitute for rights. April 21st becomes a day of corridor building, moving from point to point, never staying long enough to be found, using the swamp as a set of locked doors. The weapons travel at the center of the group, not because Elias is hoarding power, but because the group understands what the guns represent. One warning shot is not just sound, it's a message. The patrol is not the only side with force anymore. Even if the guns are damp, even if the powder is imperfect, the patrol cannot assume safety. The patrol must now consider caution, and caution is slow. Slow is life for the fugitives. By late morning, the patrol's presence is felt, not seen clearly, but sensed in the distance. A faint shout, a horse's agitation, the crack of brush pushed aside too clumsily. Ketteridge is searching, but he is searching with men who do not trust each other anymore. Every time a branch snaps, they wonder if a muzzle is pointed at them. They keep their heads lower than they ever did when they had weapons. They are, for the first time, aware of vulnerability. This is the reversal that matters. The patrol is now moving through the swamp as if it belongs to someone else. Elias uses that. He does not fire into them. He does not need blood to make the point. He fires into the air once, one sharp report that slices the swamp quiet, and then the group moves immediately, because the shot is not an invitation to fight. It is a stop sign. It is humiliation compressed into sound. The patrol freezes. Some drop to knees instinctively. Someone curses. Someone calls for the captain. Ketteridge's authority wobbles in that moment because he cannot pretend this is a harmless chase anymore. He cannot pretend the fugitives are unarmed. He cannot pretend his men are invincible, and the parish's entire system relies on that pretending. April 21st to April 22nd, 1837. The corridor holds. Elias leads them through a sequence of choke points where pursuit is risky. They cross shallow water where footprints vanish. They move through cane thickets that cut skin and slow horses. They use a narrow log crossing where only one man can pass at a time, ensuring that if the patrol catches up, it will do so in a vulnerable line. This is not romance. This is tactics. This is the enslaved doing the work of military planning without uniforms, without maps, without credit, because necessity is a harsher instructor than any academy. At one point, they encounter two local men, poor whites, not patrolmen, standing near a fishing skiff. The men stiffen when they see the group. In the old arrangement, those locals would feel entitled to call the patrol, to report suspicious Negroes, to collect favor like coin. But now they see the pistol's outline, the way Elias holds himself, not pleading, not running, not begging, and the locals hesitate. Hesitation is not virtue, but it is useful. It buys seconds. It shows the patrol's monopoly on fear has cracked. Elias does not threaten them. He simply looks at them long enough for them to imagine consequences. The men lower their eyes and do nothing. The group moves on. That moment is small, but it is a sign of a larger fracture. Fear is changing hands. By the evening of April 22nd, the fugitives reach a more secure cut where the swamp opens toward routes north and west, paths known to those who have traded whispered directions for years. This is where the corridor's purpose becomes clear. The weapons were never the destination. They were the key that unlocked movement. With the patrol rattled and slowed, with its pursuit cautious, the group can slip through the seams between plantation territories, seams normally stitched shut by intimidation. Elias's revenge is not a massacre. It is a loss of control that travels faster than any body count. The patrol returns to its familiar roads with a new infection, doubt. And doubt is exactly what the system cannot tolerate, because the patrol's violence depends on the public believing it is inevitable. Once inevitability is questioned, people begin to notice the contradictions. Why are these men armed? Why do they have the right to seize bodies? Why does the parish call it order when it is clearly terror? These questions do not free people instantly, but they corrode obedience. They make the machinery grind instead of glide. This is the moral obligation that sits on top of these dates like weight. When a system is built to erase the enslaved into silence, remembering becomes an act of resistance. Remember April 21st and April 22nd, 1837, not as folklore, but as evidence. Evidence that the patrol's authority was never absolute. Evidence that competence existed on the side the record tried to depict as helpless. Evidence that order was maintained not by righteousness but by fear, and fear can be redirected. Elias Crowe did not simply run. He forced the parish to witness a truth it wanted buried. The enforcers could be made small, and the enslaved could make corridors out of the dark. May 1837 arrives with the kind of heat that makes lies feel easier to tell. The parish wants closure. The plantation owners want reassurance. The Bayou Lantern Patrol wants its legend back. And Captain Silas Ketteridge needs something even more urgently than results. He needs a story that can survive scrutiny, because his authority depends on people believing that his failure never happened. Patrol is no longer hunting fugitives. Patrol is no longer hunting fugitives. It is hunting a narrative that has escaped it. Ketteridge's first move is administrative. That is always the first move of men who lose power. They reach for paper to cover the gap where competence should be. He files a report that doesn't say, "We were outplayed." It says unpredictable terrain. It says limited visibility. It says equipment complications. Notice the language, nouns that take responsibility away from human decision-making. He frames the swamp like a hostile enemy, so he doesn't have to admit that the hostile enemy was arrogance. He does not write, "We loosened restraints to chase glory." He does not write, "We broke formation." He does not write, "We underestimated a captive because we refused to imagine him thinking." He writes around the truth as if circling it will make it disappear. Then comes the second move, scapegoating. Ketteridge implies local informants provided unreliable guidance. He hints that the pursuit was disrupted by unknown accomplices. He inflates the number of fugitives involved because a bigger enemy makes his failure look less personal. He begins to speak of Elias Crowe not as a man but as a phantom A cunning agitator, a dangerous influence, the kind of language used to justify future violence without needing evidence. When the system cannot catch a person, it turns that person into a myth so it can keep killing in the name of prevention. In St. Martin Parish, May becomes a month of tightening. The patrol does not do this because it has no reason to do so. It is not a patrol. It is a security force. The patrol does not do this because it has regained control. It does it because it has lost control and needs the parish to feel the whip again, needs everyone to remember who is supposed to be afraid. This is how regimes respond when they are embarrassed. They compensate with volume. They overcorrect. They make the innocent suffer as proof that they still can. Plantation owners begin holding their own meetings, not to ask whether the patrol's violence is moral, but to ask whether it is effective. That distinction matters. Morality is not the language of this system. Profit is. They talk about property loss and discipline. They use the word stability like a prayer. And behind those discussions sits an unspoken fear. If the patrol can be disarmed, then the entire regional arrangement is less stable than it claims. If the patrol can be humiliated, then there are other possibilities. Possibilities that cannot be taxed, cannot be policed, cannot be neatly purchased. Ketteridge hears the whispers. He hears them in taverns. He hears them in courthouse corridors. He hears them in the way men look at him a half-second longer before nodding. The patrol's legend has always been partially theater, but theater requires an audience that agrees to suspend disbelief. After April 20th, disbelief is in the air. Men begin asking, quietly, where the missing weapons went. They ask why the patrol returned without Elias. They ask why a cooperative subject vanished. They ask why the patrol's own men tell different versions of the same night. The story fractures because the truth was never consolidated. There was no clean fight to romanticize. No enemy body to blame, no heroic report. There was only confusion. And confusion is a poison to authority. By late May, recruitment suffers. Not openly, not with formal resignations. It shows up in excuses. A man is too busy with the crop. Another claims illness. Another says he can't spare the horse. These are rationalizations, but they point to the same underlying fact. The patrol has been exposed as vulnerable, and vulnerable men with weapons become afraid of the very work that used to make them feel powerful. The swamp did not just swallow guns, it swallowed confidence. That loss is contagious. The patrol changes routes. This is not strategy. It is avoidance dressed as strategy. They stop pushing as deep into the back swamps. They keep closer to roads and ridges. They focus more on intimidation near plantations and less on extended pursuit in hard ground. In other words, they retreat to places where their advantage is largest and their risk is smallest, because dominance is easier when the environment is controlled. And every enslaved person who watches these changes learns something the system cannot afford them to learn. The patrol's reach has limits. The patrol's courage has conditions. June 1837 becomes the month the parish tries to repair its image. Ketteridge makes public appearances. He speaks louder. He rides with extra men. He stages visible patrols through town, rifles polished, posture stiff, as if polish can replace credibility. He wants the parish to see the patrol as inevitable again, but inevitability, once punctured, doesn't return easily. People remember embarrassment, especially embarrassed men. Especially men whose power depends on being feared. Ketteridge becomes harsher. That is the predictable final symptom. When authority weakens, it grows crueler to compensate. More stops, more beatings, more examples. The patrol turns its frustration onto the nearest bodies it can legally harm. That is not a side effect. That is a design feature of oppression. When it fails, it punishes. And then there is Elias Crowe, the man the patrol cannot place back in a cage, so it tries to erase him into rumor. By June, the parish has multiple versions of what happened to him, because uncertainty allows the system to choose whichever version best serves its needs. One rumor says he drowned. Another says he fled north. Another says he was aided by outsiders. Another insists he was killed quietly, off the books, because the patrol cannot tolerate an unresolved humiliation. The truth is this: the record is designed not to preserve his life, but to protect the patrol's face. If Elias lives, he is evidence. If Elias vanishes, the parish can pretend the wound was never real. That is why remembering is not optional. It is an ethical requirement. The system relied on forgetting the names, forgetting the dates, forgetting the mechanics of how violence operated, forgetting that order was bought with terror. When we let the story blur into folklore, we do the patrol's work for it. We allow men like Ketteridge to hide behind weather and terrain and confusion, as if power is innocent when it fails. But power is not innocent. It is accountable. And April 1837 provides the chain of accountability in plain sequence. Capture, coercion, arrogance, fragmentation, disarmament, escape, and then a frantic bureaucratic scramble to reclaim the myth. So we mark it. April 17th, 1837. The arrest framed as an ending. April 18th and 19th. Permission disguised as law, pride disguised as strategy. April 20th. The patrol's weapons stripped without a heroic battle, leaving only humiliation. April 21st and 22nd, the corridor opened, not by magic, but by discipline and the patrol's fear of its own vulnerability. May and June, 1837. Retaliation and narrative repair, the system tightening its grip because it knows the grip can slip. If you're listening from a place that has its own buried ledger, comment your location, not to make this personal, but to make it accountable. Because these stories did not happen in a vacuum. They happened in communities, under laws, among neighbors. Subscribe if you want more names held in the open where the record tried to lose them. And if you have a theory about what happened to Elias Crowe after June 1837, where he went, who sheltered him, whether he survived, leave it. Bring your theories like evidence, not entertainment. The least we can do is refuse the silence that the patrol depended on.